He's actually the third founder of Apple, you're right. And he sold his shares in Apple 10% for $2,300 that today is worth $70 billion. And the point of why I bring up Ronald Wayne is that sometimes in life, you choose to take a Tuesday out of your life and come along and learn from someone like David Orban. And maybe it might be a really important piece of information that it might be very valuable one day. That I'm sure Ronald Wayne knew what he knew today back then. So let's look at some of the things around the world. If we look at Delta Airlines, it's the biggest airline in the world. It's in something like 66 countries, 330 cities. It's got about 80,000 staff, and it's worth about $30 billion, but $19 billion of that is airplanes. You compare that to Uber, and they are in over 75 countries now, over 400 cities. They've got about 10,000 team members, and from a valuation perspective, I'm not quite sure anymore, but somewhere between 50 and 60 billion. Take Marriott Hotels, the biggest hotel chain in the group in the world. It does 679,000 bed nights per night, and also got a massive staff component. It's worth about $20 billion. And you compare it to Airbnb, that does 1.5 million bed nights, so more than double. It's got a staff of less than 5,000, and it's worth $31 billion. Now the question is, what is the difference between these companies? Why are these tech companies creating such massive valuations? What's that? In your pocket? Cost of entry is very low. They're using technology. They're global. No infrastructure. That's a good one. They own no cars. They own no hotels. No risk. Very accessible.
I was going to say we need self-drive airplanes.
Self-drive airplanes. Jeez, that sounds a bit scary. So for me, when you look at all these, there's been massive valuations created, and in simple terms, there's really three things that they do. They cut out the middleman, they cut out the costs, and they increase the accessibility, the trust, and the transparency. You look at almost any tech company, that's what they're doing. And in simple terms, what I think is really important is that you're here today, and David is sharing with you. And for 20 years, the internet has been something of excitement, but to many people, it's also been a disappointment. But we're at an inflection point. We're at a tipping point. And going forward, your life is either going to be one of chaos or amazement. And you get to choose in terms of where this tech's going. So when you look at these companies, Uber, Facebook, Alibaba, and Airbnb, someone said it already, they don't have any cars or hotels. In simple terms, all of these companies are data companies. That's actually what they are. They're data companies. And for us, what I found fascinating when I did the research was that when you go back to all these companies, there's two things that create massive value. It's when there's a market that is inefficient and effectively horrible to use and costly. Pardon? Banks, yeah. Well, let's just look at taxis. Before Uber came along, was it easy or nice to catch a taxi? Was it a pleasant experience? And was it cheap? It wasn't. So it's just a good example of how I completely agree with you in the banking industry. And then also, when you buy a house, is it an easy process? Is it a cost-effective process? Efficient process? So you see, for me, it gets easier and easier to look for where the markets are going to change, because it's where clients are frustrated, it's inefficient, and it's expensive. In the real estate market, what's interesting is that we've spoken a lot today around technological disruption, but actually what's happening in parallel is there's a massive cultural disruption as well, which is having a really meaningful impact. And a lot of people talk about going global and how you need to be global, but it's not that easy to actually go global unless you're solving a global problem. So the one thing that I find fascinating in blockchain is that you go to Puerto Rico and you meet all these young Americans, and they're blockchaining everything. They want to blockchain Valpre water, so I know where the source of this bottle came from. Now that's wonderful. It's not seriously a big problem in the world, is it? So, For us, I explained to you earlier the problems in terms of the wealth gap. And one of the things that Peter Diamandis talks about is the greatest opportunities are where the biggest problems are. And so that is why we're going after the greatest problem in terms of the wealth gap. And just like all these other brands, we basically decided that, there's, like I've said to you already, there's three things. You cut out the middleman, you cut out the costs, and you increase the trust, the transparency, and the accessibility. That's what all of them have done. And so when you look at the tech industry, Kevin mentioned it this morning, this is what's called the J curve. It's also known as the valley of death, and it's called the valley of pain. There's lots of fun names for it. But in simple terms, when you start a linear business, you effectively grow, and as your revenues grow, you increase the size of the business. But in a marketplace and tech platform environment, you have to invest in the platform before the revenues and the profit actually pay. And so that's where the investment comes in, and then it catches up. Now, a lot of companies don't make it to blue sky because they die in this valley of death, basically. But this is what Kevin was talking about, the challenges of building a tech and a platform company, because you need to invest on the front end to build the critical mass. But there's plenty of examples of massive wealth that has been created. I mean, we've got Airbnb that was effectively went to $1 billion in 6 years. Zoopla went to $1 billion in 7 years. Auction.com went to $1 billion in 7 years. And it just gives you an idea of what is created. And really where this started in the real estate space was in 2014, Realty Mogul was the first crowdfunding site to get $9 million. Then came along Fundrise, and they actually raised $31 million at over $100 million valuation, also in 2014. But what was fascinating is last year, when the SEC changed the crowdfunding rules in America, they went out to their market, and they basically said to their market, look guys, most people have never heard of startups. You've all heard of Amazon and Facebook that have IPO'd, and you probably missed the value creation. None of you can really get involved in an Airbnb or an Uber. You should have really got involved in the growth phase, but you didn't really know about them at the time. So they went out to their network and they said, well, why don't you invest with us in the growth phase? And does anyone know how much money they raised? $93 million in 48 hours. And what was fascinating is they were only allowed to take 50 million because that's the SEC law. You can't take more than 50 million. But it just shows you the power of communities. And then there's one in the UK called Property Partner that's raised 27 million, and you can invest in properties there from £50. And there's a group out of Co-Assets, which are out of Singapore, that invested on the Australian Stock Exchange, and they also were valued at 85 million, and they're on the Australian Stock Exchange. But the question that for us, we sat back, and Kevin mentioned Salesforce. What I love about Salesforce is that in 1999, Mark Benioff went to all the venture capitalists and he said, listen guys, I'm going to put CRM, which stands for Customer Relationship Management, in the cloud. And they pretty much laughed at him. They said, it's never going to happen. No one will ever let their customer details leave their servers and go in the cloud. And so he said, okay, well, let me go to my clients and work with my clients. And so he formed a thing called Design Partners. And today, Salesforce is the 14th biggest technology company in the world. But what I liked about that story was that it created a collaborative environment where, the clients were also the investors, and so, they could consistently be helping with the user experience and what should work or shouldn't work. And so in 2014, when we read the book, we had investors that were investing in the real estate deals that said, hey, how do we invest in the platform? Henny and I had invested in the company. We were pretty much going 1-for-1 in Migrate. And as I've joked a few times, Henny has a lot more ones than me, so I was running out of ones. And so we decided this story really worked for us. So we effectively created the Wealth Partners, and today we've got 130 Wealth Partners, 131 actually now, Wealth Partners around the world. And there's 6 major areas. There's business, there's real estate, people that like the real estate side, there's the technology. Back on Henny's farm in October 2015, we were talking about creating a digital currency. And 2.5 years later, we're here with Wealthy Coin. We've got the investors, both online and offline, and the community. We've got the vision and the mission. We've got exponential technologies, which is really what today is all about. And then I've said the business part. So this is basically a group of empowered people. And I don't know if you do or don't know this, but the honeycomb is the most resilient structure in nature. Do you know that? And our whole business has been built on nature's principles. So we believed it, we called it the Wealth Collaborative Economy Honeycomb. And what I tend to joke with people is that, this was the Fundrise slide. I do believe it's wrong because Airbnb and Uber are in, many, many countries, and Fundrise is in one country. So they should probably change this graph because that company is in 111 countries. Anyway, CrowdCube, last year in March, I was invited to South by Southwest to talk about fintech, and I was on stage with the guy from CrowdCube. Now, this is the most successful crowdfunding platform, and you're about to hear from the one in Africa, but this is the most successful one in England. And they were raising $1 million in 98 seconds. £1 million, in 98 seconds. And that's when it started to get my attention. I was like, wow, we should maybe start looking at this crowdfunding thing. And then actually what happened to me was, it was the 1st of June last year, and Voisa, who's talking after lunch, after tea, basically said to me, well, what do you think about an ICO? And, I don't know if you've ever presented before, but there's nothing worse than when you get asked a question and you don't even know what the acronym stands for. You can't bullshit your way when you don't even know what the thing stands for. So I was like, sorry, I don't know what that means. But anyway, so for those of you who don't know what an ICO, and I think, Paul, you're going to explain what it is, so I'll let you go to it. But in simple terms, it's an initial coin offering. And when I understood what it was, I was like, wow, that really takes what we've got with our wealth partner community and it puts it on steroids because you can really expand the community globally. And so what's happening in this space, and I don't have time today to go into the details, although if you want me to, we can make a plan to talk through the ICOs later in terms of security and utility and everything that's happening. But it really is changing the rules of the game in terms of how companies are being funded. And if I show you this slide here, I've told you about the wealthy coin. So for me, this slide here, there's been massive capital raised. And there's a great slide that I want to share with you. If you look, this is just in the real estate space. So this lady, Proppy, is 26 years old. They raised $17 million. I met her, Kevin and I met her in Vegas. They've never left California. They basically, these guys, yeah. So they write nice white papers and then they raise capital. And it's amazing in terms of how much money's been raised in the space, considering the people don't even have experience or platforms. And so this for us is the vision that Jaco really was the architect behind. And you can see, I spoke this morning about GIDS, which is our global investment due diligence system. And there's Migrate. And think of it like Amazon and AWS. So Amazon needed to have servers to run their platform. So they created AWS. And then they thought that, well, hang on, we're using AWS, but lots of other people could use AWS. So they outsourced AWS. So think of it from Migrate's perspective. We're helping people invest, around the world, and we needed to have a blockchain exchange pretty much in the cloud. So that's what we need to build. And then we thought, well, why do we just need it? Why doesn't all the other crowdfunding sites, private equity, private real estate funds, real estate portfolios, anyone that wants to do, have liquidity and cross-border? And so you've got the KYC, you've got the third party, you've got the smart contracts, you've got the real estate register, and it all comes together in the ecosystem around the wealthy exchange. And the wealthy coin is the catalyst that ultimately unlocks the whole ecosystem. I've shown you these numbers. I did this with David a while ago. Having traveled with Kevin, literally, Kevin said, 10 different countries. What's blown us away in this ICO space is that the majority of them are running around promising that they're going to change the world. But we believe that the three things that we've been told by all the key investors that you need to look for is, firstly, does it have an existing business that's making money? And from our perspective, we've now got 2 years of post $1 million of revenue, and this year we're on track for north of 4 million. Then it's got, does it have an existing team? I don't really care if you've got $100 million in the bank. It is difficult to build a good team. Any entrepreneur in the room would know what I'm talking about. So if you've got an existing team that knows how to execute in any market, and I've explained to you, the board and even the leadership team. And the one that I think is most important is, are you solving a great problem? Economics is quite a simple thing. If there's fixed supply, you've got to have a demand for the solution. Does that make sense? And so, we've been through it. There needs to be a demand, and then it also needs to be explained. So when the internet happened in 1990, how many of you were on the internet in 1990? Cliff, 2. So what most people don't realize is that Netscape was actually invented on the 15th of December 1994. And in 1995 was effectively the internet's tipping point because it got mass consumer adoption because most of us could actually use Netscape and we couldn't program in the other languages that were needed to use the internet. Does that make sense? So the same thing here, and that's why I believe that, even when I talk to my mom who's a teacher, and my brother who's a doctor, and you say, hey, do you want to buy Bitcoin? They sort of look at me like I'm talking a foreign language. But if you can dumb it down to something that people understand, like property, it really changes the rules of the game in terms of what's happening. So, these are just some of the growth numbers that have been happening. We're growing by nearly 64% a month at the moment. This is a graph that Kevin did, so that's the 111 countries that the members are in. This is the transactions. So you can see we tripled from last year 2016 to 2017. And this year we're looking to do a minimum of 2,000, although, preferably higher than that. We got investors from 44 countries already. And for me, I just want to finish off before we close out. Is that really, from our perspective at a selfish level, if people are wanting to know what the opportunities are, you can go on the platform and you can invest in direct real estate. So you can choose between England, Australia, America, or South Africa, and you can invest in direct real estate. The second thing is that you can invest in the wealthy coin. So Kevin is going to do a demonstration. So about 4 o'clock this afternoon, we're going to finish off the Q&A panel. And for those who want to go home, they can. But for those who actually want to sit and watch how to use the platform, how to log in and get an ERC20 token and understand how all this technology is working, we're actually going to do an interactive workshop session from 4 to 5. And anyone that actually logs in and is on the Wealth Migrate platform is going to be airdropped, I think it's 100 wealthy coins. Now, I don't know if you know when Bitcoin launched, the value of a Bitcoin was 1/400th of a US cent. And today they're worth plus minus $8,000. So don't discount what things are given to you sometimes. The partner program is for those people who are in the real estate and financial and investment space. Melanie's actually here. And we've now got a completely sophisticated digital way to track the entire process. So there's transparency for everyone. So if people are interested from that perspective. And the fourth one is join our Wealth Partner program. And Kevin, who's the MC and the guy that spoke earlier this morning, he's the one that really runs that Wealth Partner. So if you're interested, chat to me, chat to him. There are feedback forms. Write it on a feedback form, and we can let you know the details. The last thing I would like to say on this is that we sat with the board at the end of last year, and we'd actually agreed, and Sean Quinn was one of the guys that when we were at the Wealth Weekend, and we were doing a capital raise at the time, and I sat with the board and I said, guys, listen, we don't want to make people have to choose between a Wealth Partner investment or a wealthy coin investment, because they come to me and they say to me, which one's better? I'm like, I don't know, what do you, you're sort of damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. So what we agreed at the board level was if people invested as a Wealth Partner, they actually were given wealthy coins, a percentage of wealthy coins. And for this show, I'm not allowed to, we're not allowed to publicly do this. But for our own private, friends and family conversation like this, if you are interested, we are letting people, we're doing one final tranche before the crowd sale on the 4th of April, where we're allowing people to come in as Wealth Partners and get coins as well. So I'm just letting you know about that. So you actually don't have to choose. So if you think the coin is worth 0, it doesn't matter because you've got shares in the company. And our benefit, I believe that we actually all benefit then because we win on both sides of the fence. The company's successful, the coin's successful, it doesn't matter because you're on both sides of the fence. And so from my perspective, that really is, just to give you a little bit of an understanding between and how it all is. If you're interested and, want to understand the financials and everything, we've got it all. We can put it all together and, share it with you in terms of the process. There's a whole breakdown in terms of the Wealth Partners and how it actually works and what the expected returns are, and et cetera, et cetera. And then, to finish off, I've been tracking the value of the Global Wealth Group, which is the holding company out of Hong Kong that owns all the assets. And I actually mapped it on the life of Salesforce. And it's quite interesting because we're sort of sitting over there. We haven't left the runway yet. We're still on the runway in terms of what Salesforce did in the life cycle of Salesforce. So, guys, that's all from my side. I think it's time to hand back to Kevin. And if anyone's got any questions, what I'll do is we've got the Q&A after lunch in terms of the process. But just while Kevin's coming up, does anyone have anything that I can answer for you? No? Yep. Yeah, so great question. So the question was, how do you invest in I presume, like, well, any crypto and or wealthy? And Kevin's actually going to run through that. That's going to be the demo session at 4 o'clock. We found in Johannesburg, so actually the feedback when we did our last event was that people said to us, look, you guys have shared a lot of information, but we didn't ever get practical. So they actually asked us to do a practical session. So today, if people want to leave at 4, they can, but we're actually going to do a practical session where we can actually run through it. And people can see how the platform works, how to do it, and even copy and do it themselves, So, okay.
Thank you very much, Scott.
Yep.